I never thought betrayal could sound so polite. It began with the soft clearing of a lawyer's throat, a shuffle of papers, and the faint hum of the ceiling fan that seemed to mock the stillness in the room. The air smelled of mahogany and dust, of endings disguised as formality. My children sat across from me. Daniel in his neatly pressed suit, Grace with her hair pulled back too tightly, both of them wearing expressions that looked more like restraint than grief. I kept my hands folded in my lap, the widow's posture I'd perfected over the past month. My heart, however, refused to obey. It beat against my ribs like it was trying to warn me that what came next would change everything. "Mrs. Carter," the lawyer began, his tone calm but clinical, "your late husband's wishes are quite clear." He read through the list of assets as if narrating someone else's life. The yacht, the vacation home, the business shares, all went to the children of the deceased. Every word landed like a quiet blow. When he finally reached my name, the pause that followed was almost merciful. "To his wife, Evelyn Carter," he continued, glancing briefly in my direction, "he leaves his love and appreciation for her many years of devotion." That was all. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Even the fan seemed to hesitate, spinning slower, like it couldn't bear to move the air between us. Grace looked down, her lips parting as if to speak, but Daniel was quicker. "Mom," he said softly, "Dad wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable. We'll help you manage things." Manage things. The word stung. I wanted to ask what there was left for me to manage when everything I had built, every late night and quiet compromise, now belonged to them. But I couldn't find my voice. Instead, I looked at the lawyer, his eyes lowered, avoiding mine. He'd read dozens of wills before, I was sure. But maybe not one where a woman watched her life, her home, her sacrifices, erased by a few lines of legal language. When the meeting ended, Daniel offered to drive me home. I refused. The silence in my car was kinder than the sympathy in their eyes. As I turned the key in the ignition, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, the faint trace of lipstick, the grief-lined eyes, the woman who had traded ambition for love and found herself empty-handed. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, and I had just learned how invisible devotion could be. Still, beneath the ache, something stirred, a quiet, unfamiliar defiance. I didn't know it yet, but this ending was only the beginning. I met Richard Carter when I was 21, the age when love feels like destiny and red flags look like ribbons. He was 11 years older, confident, articulate, and already successful enough to command every room he entered. I was drawn to him instantly, not just for his charm, but for how certain he seemed of the future. My own was still a blank page, his, already bound in leather. We married within a year. What began as a partnership slowly evolved into an arrangement, one where my life bent around his ambitions. I gave up teaching after our twins, Daniel and Grace, were born. Just for a few years, I told myself. But those years stretched into decades, until I could no longer recall when my dreams became background noise. Richard built Carter Marine Exports from the ground up, often gone for weeks, chasing contracts and investors. I built something less visible, a home that functioned even in his absence. I remembered birthdays, soothed fevers, hosted dinners, and smiled through exhaustion. My contribution wasn't written in company records, but it was etched into the very rhythm of our family. Daniel inherited his father's precision, the calm efficiency that leaves no room for emotion. Grace, more sensitive, often played mediator between us when tensions rose. They loved me in their own ways, but as they grew, I began to sense the quiet hierarchy forming in our family. Richard's world revolved around achievement, and somewhere along the line, so did theirs. When Richard was diagnosed with lung cancer, it was as though the house itself exhaled in disbelief. The man who had always seemed unshakable was suddenly fragile. I nursed him through it, every appointment, every sleepless night, clinging to the illusion that devotion could buy forgiveness for years of distance. He would sometimes take my hand and whisper, "You'll be all right, Evie. You always are." But the night before he passed, he said something different. His voice was weak, yet deliberate. Take care of them, Evie. They'll need you more than you think. I thought it was a plea for unity. I didn't realize it was a warning. Now, sitting in an empty house filled with echoes of his absence, I saw his legacy not in the framed business awards on the wall, but in the way our children spoke to me, with careful courtesy, the same detached tone he once used when love had become an obligation. Grief has a strange way of sharpening truth. For 35 years, I mistook endurance for partnership. But love, I was learning, doesn't always return the way you give it. And as I looked around at the empire I helped sustain but did not own, I began to wonder whether my life had been a marriage or a quiet apprenticeship in sacrifice. The days after the will reading passed in a blur. Polite condolences, casserole dishes I never touched, and an ache that settled somewhere between my ribs and my throat. The house, once alive with Richard's authority and the children's laughter, had turned into a museum of silence. Grace was the first to visit. She came armed with tulips and forced cheerfulness, as though color could disguise discomfort. "Mom, you're not eating properly," she said, setting a vase on the counter. "You have to take care of yourself." "I've been doing that for 35 years, I replied quietly. "I'm rather good at it." Her smile faltered. She busied herself rearranging the flowers, avoiding my eyes. "Daniel's been handling Dad's accounts. There's so much to go through." "I'm sure," I said, though the edge in my voice betrayed me. 2 nights later, Daniel arrived unannounced, wearing the same cologne his father favored. The scent filled the hall, dragging memory with it. "Mom, we need to talk about the property," he said, straight to business. "The maintenance costs are too high. Grace and I think selling would be practical." "Practical," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "And where do you expect me to go?" He sighed, patient but detached. "We'll make sure you're comfortable. Maybe a smaller place, closer to Grace." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so rehearsed. "You sound just like your father." Daniel didn't flinch. "That's not an insult, Mom." "Isn't it?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Dad trusted us with this. You should, too." It was then I realized the inheritance wasn't just wealth. It was belief, his belief in them, and his quiet doubt in me. After he left, I wandered into Richard's study for the first time since his death. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, his handwriting scrawled across margins like ghosts of unfinished thoughts. In the bottom drawer, beneath old invoices and ledgers, I found a small leather notebook. Most pages were filled with company notes, but one entry stopped me cold. "Evelyn will never understand. She's content without money. She deserves peace, not burden." The words blurred as my eyes welled. Peace, that word again, as if my silence all those years had been serenity, not surrender. I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest. A lifetime of loyalty, reduced to a misunderstanding. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the faint reflection of my own face in the glass. Outside, the world moved on, unaware that a woman inside this grand, empty house had just realized her life's worth had been quietly rewritten by those she loved most. And for the first time, I began to wonder what my life might look like if I stopped waiting to be chosen. Morning came gray and heavy, as though the world itself hesitated to begin. I moved through the house in silence, touching walls that no longer felt like mine. Every photograph, every curtain, every faint perfume of memory whispered the same cruel reminder. I had given my life to something that never truly belonged to me. But grief, I've learned, is a patient teacher. It waits, quietly, until you're ready to listen. While sorting through Richard's old things, I came across the piano bench in the living room, the one he bought for me on our 10th anniversary. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were sheet music, faded programs, and an envelope tucked between 2 brittle pages of Chopin. My name was written on it in his careful hand. I froze. For a moment, I considered not opening it. Some truths, once known, can't be returned to silence. But curiosity, or perhaps need, won. The letter inside was short, but each word landed like a confession. Evie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you probably hate me for what the will said. You have every right to.
But you deserve to know why.
The business isn't what it seems. For years I've carried debts, favors owed to men who don't forgive easily. If I left you the company, the house, the accounts, they would come for you. I couldn't bear that. The children think they've inherited wealth, but what they've really inherited is a burden. I trust them to face it together. You've spent your life serving others, Evie. I wanted, for once, to give you freedom, a life untouched by obligation. There's a private account in your name, enough to keep you comfortable, enough to start again. The documents are with Mr. Lawson, our family lawyer. He'll tell you when you're ready. I never meant to erase you. I only wanted to protect you, in the only way I knew how. Richard. My breath hitched as I read and reread those lines. Protection. That was his final act, misguided, clumsy, but born from something that might still be called love. I pressed the letter to my chest and, for the first time since his death, allowed myself to weep, not for what was lost, but for the years we both misunderstood each other. I had spent my life craving recognition, while he'd spent his last days trying to give me release. Outside, the first light of morning slipped through the curtains, brushing against the piano keys. The house didn't feel like a monument anymore. It felt like a closed chapter. And as I folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, I realized that peace was never something he could give me. It was something I would have to claim for myself. It took me weeks to decide what to do with the letter. I read it every morning at the kitchen table, tracing the indentation of Richard's pen, as if by touching his words I could still reach him. But grief had changed shape, no longer sharp, just heavy. When I finally visited Mr. Lawson, the family lawyer, he confirmed everything. The private account existed, separate and untouched. Enough, he said, for me to live without worry. The irony was cruel. Richard had given me freedom, but only after I'd forgotten what to do with it. I sold the house. Not because Daniel or Grace insisted, but because I needed to leave before the walls became mausoleums of memory. The day the moving truck came, I walked through each room one last time. The dining table where birthdays blurred into arguments. The study where ambition replaced conversation. The piano, my piano, which I left behind. Some ghosts need a place to stay. I moved to a small seaside town where no one knew my name. The cottage was modest, with peeling shutters and a garden that smelled of rosemary and salt. I began teaching again. Art classes at a local community center. My students painted the world in colors I'd forgotten existed. One of them, a young mother with paint on her hands, once asked, "Were you always an artist?" I smiled.
No.
But I always wanted to be. Months later, Grace visited. Her voice cracked when she told me the truth about the company, the debts, the lawsuits, the unraveling legacy. "You were right, Mom," she whispered. "We didn't inherit wealth. We inherited his mistakes." I held her hand and felt no bitterness, only tenderness. "Then learn from them," I said. "That's the only inheritance worth keeping." Daniel came next, quieter, humbled. We walked along the beach in silence until he finally said, "I never thanked you for everything." I looked at him, at the man who still carried his father's face but none of his walls, and simply nodded. "You just did." In the evenings, I sit by my window and listen to the waves. The ocean doesn't ask for anything. It just moves, endlessly renewing itself. Maybe that's what peace truly is, not an absence of pain, but the quiet acceptance that life continues despite it. Sometimes I take out Richard's letter, not to mourn, but to remember. He didn't give me peace. He gave me the chance to find it on my own. And now, when I sign my name at the bottom of a student's painting or breathe in the scent of sea air, I whisper the truth I once couldn't see. Freedom was never something I lost. It was something I had simply forgotten to claim.